Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining China's Climate Policies and Their Impact on China and the U.S. Economy, a special webinar collaboration between Remy and Dr. Le-Le Zou of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Dr. Le-Le Zou is an associate professor in the Institute of Science and Development at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Her research interests focus on the modeling, analysis, and assessment of energy, environment, economic policy, including policy analysis and modeling on energy and relating sectors, analysis on the applications of new low-carbon technologies and markets, and analysis on the impact and vulnerability to environmental change and climate change in global and regional scales. Dr. Zou has published more than 30 peer-reviewed research articles in international journals and book chapters, and has chaired more than 20 national-level research projects. We are honored to have her join today's presentation. A little bit about Remy. Regional Economic Models Incorporated was founded in 1980 on a transformative idea. Government decision makers should test the economic effects of their policies before they're implemented. Our experiences and development efforts have resulted in a comprehensive model that answers what-if questions about your economy. Our clients use Remy models to perform rigorous economic analysis that critically influences local, state, and national policies. Today's Remy speakers include analyst Mei Lin, analyst Jeffrey Dykes, and myself, Zachary Schofield, an associate 1 at Remy. Our presentation today will explore how technological advancements designed to reduce emissions can also lead to meaningful economic growth. Even though each country outlines its own initiatives, climate change is a global issue. Only through collaboration and communication can we effectively reduce emissions and improve the environment for all. At the conclusion of our analysis, we will have a question and answer portion, and you're welcome to submit questions to the Q&A submission portal on the bottom bar. Without further ado, I'll hand things over to Dr. Zou.
Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen in the US side, and good evening, everyone in the China side. I'm very honored to have this opportunity to present our work with Remy together. Firstly, I want to introduce my institution very briefly. I work with the Institute of Science and Development in Chinese Academy of Sciences. It is the only cross-cutting institute among nearly 200 institutes in CAS, so it is very unique. My institute mainly conducts theoretical and practical policy research, such as the innovation policy, industrial policy, sustainable development, and climate policy, etc. And then based on our researches, we have different outputs like regular academic outputs, including scientific research reports, peer-reviewed articles, books, and other publications. And more importantly, we directly provide decision suggestions for different levels of decision makers, such like the central and the provincial governments, as well as the sectorial departments and also large enterprises. My research team focuses on the policy issues on climate change and the economic green transitions. As early as the year 2012, we have been worked together with Remy on the China PI Plus model. In line with the principle of improving while using, started from the very beginning with the 5-region China model, and with the help and the funding of the Global Environment Institute. Till now, we have already developed a complete China PI Plus model with which covers all the 68 sectors in all the 31 provinces. With the China PI Plus model, we conducted research on some important projects of policy analysis and assessment, such as the China's emission trading system assessment, which is assigned and funded by the National Development and Reform Committee. And also we carried out the Guangdong Province Emission Reduction Policy Assessment, and we did analysis on the CO2 emission peaking policies, which is funded by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So today, now let's have a look at our latest work. As we all know that China's President Xi Jinping has been announced several times that China will get to the CO2 emission peak by 2030 and get to the carbon neutrality by 2060. Therefore, number of relating policies will be developed successfully. For example, eliminating the overcapacity, cap and trade system, energy structure adjustment. These are all hot issues of late. So the design and the implementation of the new policies will definitely bring a number of uncertainties, such as how about the effects of the policies and how they will impact on the China's economy. And what are the impacts on the international economy and how it works on the international trade, especially on the US and China trade. All these questions now need to be investigated. Therefore, we tried to analyze a very simple policy of CO2 emission reductions to see where the emission policies could lead us to and how it could work on the whole economy. In the baseline scenario, we set the population, the economic growth rate, and some other regular index. The population will get to 140 million in around 2030, then decreases. And the whole economy will still keep a relatively high speed of growth, with an average annual growth rate around 4%. And the proportion of service industry will keep growing and get to 60% by 2050. Also, in the baseline scenario, the energy structure will change eventually. The use of coal will decrease from the current nearly 70% to 60% in 2050, while the non-fossil fossil fuel will increase from 12% to nearly 20%. Here in this study, we are trying to see what will happen to the economy if the total CO2 emissions reduce by 10%. So, because most of the CO2 comes from the power generation, we firstly reduce the fossil fuel power generation. Accordingly, the use of renewable energy will increase. These are both achieved through investment. And then the energy use could also be reduced by technology improvement, so which could produce more output than before. To make the industrial structure better, the export and the import part are also modified. So these are our assumptions. With all the policy assumptions, we made some inputs, so we get the result here. On this slide is the impact on the general economy index. The red line is the total GDP. We can see that this, with the CO2 reduction policy, it has a positive impact on GDP. The increment is around 1% at the very beginning, then reaches more than 2%. Compared to the base, yes, the increment is compared to the baseline. And the employment and the people's income both increase under these policies. We also investigate the impacts on the US-China trade. According to the data from 2019, the textile, timbers, paper, chemical industries, the mineral products, metal products, machinery, transportation equipment, electrical machinery, artwork. These sectors are the sectors with the largest trade volume between US and China. So from this slide, we can see that with the CO2 emission reduction by 10%, we found these sectors are subjected to different impacts. Paper manufacturing, printing, education, and sports is benefited the most, followed by the textile and chemical industry, while non-metal mineral products manufacturing and the machinery manufacturing suffers the most. So the same situation happened to the changes to the impacts on the employment. Still the textile manufacturing, the timbers and these sectors impacted most. For the average wage rate, the situation got some differences. The apparel manufacturing, chemical and textile sectors are with the largest positive impacts, while the non-metal mineral products manufacturing sector looks worse than the machinery manufacturing. Then let's come back to our original idea, the CO2 emission reductions. In the baseline, the CO2 emissions will be how much is will be more than 1,000 million tons in 2030. And in the emission reduction by 10% scenario, the CO2 emissions, the total emissions is around 1 million tons less than the baseline scenario. And the CO2 reduced by around the real CO2 reduced in the scenario is around 9.37% to 7.36%, a little bit less than we said. That is largely because of the energy efficiency improvement. The emission policy impacts the export and the import too. In this scenario, the export increases around 4 to 8%, while the imports decreases by 1%. This far, we simulated very simply about what would happen to the economy if the total CO2 emission in China reduced by 10%. Beside the simple scenario, actually, there are still lots of issues should be noticed. For example, the green transition in China requires much more emphasis on the economic structure adjustment, which is a big challenge to our model. And also any small changes or fluctuations will be transmitted through the world trade and affect the United States and the whole world. So thank you very much for listening to the China's part. Then following Remy's presentation, I think will show us the bigger picture. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Zou. In the next portion, myself, Jeffrey Dykes, and Mei Lin will share a similar analysis to what a carbon policy in the United States would do to the United States economy and how it would impact trade between the United States and China. In this model, we use, in this scenario, we use two different models. One is the E3 plus and the other is the PI plus. Now, I won't read off all the information here, but as an overview, the E3 plus model is a model specifically oriented towards energy and environmental policy questions. And the PI plus model is our flagship model, and it's organized to to show the economic impacts of a variety of policies. As a framework for this analysis, we wanted to show this diagram. This complicated table, these two complicated tables, show the interactions of the different economic variables within each model. As you can see, if we change one variable, that change can be modeled as it ripples through the economy. And so for both nations independently, the impact of a carbon policy, Dr. Zou has just shared how that policy would impact the Chinese economy. And we'll show here in the next little bit what a similar policy in the United States would do in the United States economy. After these independent analyses, we can then extract the international trade variables, specifically exports and imports coming to and from each country. And we can then apply each nation's respective international trade variables and apply them to the alternating nation. So as an example, we can show what the impact of the United States carbon policy would be in the United States. Such a policy would have impact on the volume of exports the United States sells and the number of imports that it buys. We can then use that number, convert it into the Chinese model, and show what the domestic policy in the United States would do in the economy in China. So in this simulation, you'll see two scenarios. The first is that domestic impact of an American carbon policy in the United States. And the second scenario is how a United States carbon policy would impact trade between the United States and China. Mei Lin will introduce the policy variables and will share the results of those findings. Jeffrey Dykes will share how that domestic policy will impact international trade. And I'll finish up with a short summary. And after my summary, we'll have time for questions. You can take it away, Mei.
Thank you, Zach. So I'm gonna go through the first section, the national energy policies. Let's first review the China energy policy introduced by Dr. Zou. The graphs are showing the changes in the imports of goods and services. So before 2043, China has a decrease in the imports. And part of the change, both the decrease at first and then the increase that is coming later, is from the US. And we will estimate that number, the US part, and use it in the international trade scenario later. As for the US energy policy scenario, we have run simulations in the US E3 plus model, and the two inputs are set to cover years from 2021 to 2050. The first input is a 10% increase in fuel cost, representing the policy to curb energy consumption, such as a carbon tax. The second input is a 0.2% decrease in production cost. The amount of decrease starts at 0 in 2021 and scales down to negative 0.2% by 2050. This is representing an economic trend responding to the carbon tax. And in the end, we will run both policy variables inputs. First, we will start with the increase in fuel cost only. The graphs are from the E3 Plus model showing the difference of the simulation from the baseline economy. We can see that there is a decrease in both total employment and labor force. You can also check the relative fuel cost. As we have input, there's a same effect of 10% increase in every industry sectors here. However, for the relative cost of production, we can see that the effects are different between in the industry sectors. Apparently, the change in the fuel cost affects energy-intensive industries more, and the top sectors are transportation and public utilities, construction, as well as manufacturing. In the results, there's also output by industry, and this information is also used to forecast the carbon emissions later. Checking on the value added by industry, we can also figure out the industries whose contribution to the GDP have been affected the most. And for the impacts on GDP and carbon dioxide emissions, they share a very similar trend, but this is only the effects from the first input, and we will see the final results from both inputs later. Next, we will go through the results from the second input, the 0.2% decrease in the production cost. It represents an economic trend responding to the increased fuel cost. Again, the graphs show the differences, the changes from the economic baseline. First, the employment and the labor force here, they're both growing all the way to year 2050. And next is the relative cost of production. The costs are relative to the baseline national cost, which is 1, and the relative cost of all industries are increasing since the first year, 2021. Due to the decreased production cost, the inputs in all industries are increasing here. And finally, we input both policy variables and get the final results. The graphs here show the changes in GDP and carbon dioxide emissions. They both decrease first, but then start to increase since year of 2030 and 2035, respectively. We can see that there is a lag of 5 years. This is because that the increase in fuel costs has larger impacts on the energy-intensive industries, while the decrease in production costs has a more even impact on all the industries. We also have total employment and imports. The total employment decreases first and start to increase since 2029. The turning point for total imports is year 2031. And in the next section, the imports will be used for calculating the trading inputs. So now I'm gonna pass it to Jeff, who will continue and show us the international trading scenarios.
Okay, thank you, May. Yeah, so I'm gonna go over the international portion. So how we're integrating both the China REMI model and the US model. We're taking inputs from results from that original simulation here. This is the first scenario. So we're taking the from the scenario that May went over, where we increased fuel cost and production cost. We're taking that change in imports and using that to calculate what the export value from China to the US is. So we have the we do that by calculating the imports from China divided by the total US the total US imports. So that equals 17%, and then we're multiplying that 17% by that result from the US model in that first scenario. So then that equals the inputs for this simulation. And then we run that through with the industry sales, international exports policy variable. So we're changing exports by year, and it's decreasing from 2021 to 2027, and then it goes positive after that. And this is showing the impact to the economy in China. So we can see how U.S. exports are or U.S. imports are directly affecting the economy there. We can see GDP just to the right of that. And then for the environmental impacts, so even though the model that we're using for China isn't a E3 model where it shows the emissions, we use a similar methodology that's used within that model just to estimate what the impacts would be on CO2 emissions. So it's partially based on the output in the results. So as the economy grows, you can see the after 2027, the CO2 emissions are more positive there. But the idea is just the goal would be to switch from coal and oil, so more carbon intensive fuel sources, to natural gas or other cleaner energy sources. So there wouldn't be as many CO2 emissions in the future. And then the next simulation has to do with the U.S. model. So with this, we're modeling it in our E3 plus 8 BEA region model, and this is based off of so we first calculate this percentage 2.88, which is it's based off of the China imports from the U.S. So just whatever the baseline value is for that, divided by total China imports. So imports that China has from all countries. So the U.S. portion of that is 2.88. So with that, we're able to multiply that by the expected change in China imports as a result of this energy policy, and then that equals the value that we input into the U.S. model under using that exports variable. And then this is the difference here. So from the baseline, we have the GDP and employment. It's negative until around 2041, and then turns positive. And yeah, so this is based off of the changes in trading from the U.S. to China, then that impact on the GDP and employment within the U.S. And then this shows impacts by region. Since that model is an 8-region model, it basically splits the US into 8 different regions. So you have the far west, Rocky Mountain, Plains, Southwest, Great Lakes, Southeast, Mideast, and New England. So we can see we're able to see the impacts by region for GDP. So we can see in 2021, the Rocky Mountain region shows the most negative impact, and then but they're around the same range. And then the environmental impacts. So this comes directly from the E3 plus model, where it shows the carbon emissions. So it's showing in millions of metric tons, how that's changing. So that's the goal of the policy to decrease those emissions, and it's showing a decrease in the emissions from baseline until around 2043. And Zach?
Great. Thank you, Jeffrey. I'll provide just a quick summary of those findings, especially as they relate to carbon emissions. So this table shows the accumulated change in emissions in both China and the United States over the time span of the analysis that we conducted. So from years 2021 to 2050. I'll just go through this table briefly. The model would indicate that over the 30-year time span, a policy in China would reduce carbon emissions from China by 33 million metric tons, and a policy in the United States would reduce American emissions by 10.5 million metric tons, accumulating in a combined reduction of 43.7 million metric tons over those 30 years. Now, the change in carbon emissions as they relate to trade are quite interesting. So as Jeffrey pointed out, after an initial reduction in carbon emissions, the model would suggest that as trade volumes increase again, it's possible that there's an increase in carbon emissions related to trade. And over the 30-year time span for China, that carbon emissions level might actually be a net positive. For the United States, that international trade related carbon emissions are just below zero. However, combined, it's quite clear that policies both in the United States and in China would result in significant reductions in carbon emissions, even though the trade numbers might increase over time.